Welcome to our conversation with experts and enthusiasts. Has been a wonderful lecture series that we started earlier this past year. I'm Reed DeVaz McGowan, the Executive Director of Eugene Public Library Foundation, and I am incredibly excited to welcome you here for our conversation with Dr. Peter Kopp. As many of you know, the foundation raises and manages donation for Eugene Public Library, advocates for resources and support for the library, and connects our community of donors to opportunities to make an impact at the library. And as many of you know, we are in the middle of our 3-week fundraising campaign with Friends of Eugene Public Library to bring mobile Wi-Fi lending to Eugene Public Library. This project has been an incredible way to give internet access to those that might not be able to otherwise get online. And for more information, please visit EPLF Foundation or eplfoundation.org/Wi-Fi. I think that link is going to go in the chat as well. As you know, if you've been to one of these before, and if you haven't, we developed this event series in order to keep people connected to each other and the quest for knowledge and inspiration that Eugene Public Library brings. We hope that you enjoy the event and select others that spark your interest. We still have a couple of left this year. And I would like to thank one of our board members, Lisa Rubenstein-Kalevi, for curating such a wonderful speakers list and bringing you all here today. And at the end of the event, we will share a resource list developed in partnership with Eugene Public Library for materials in their collection. You can request holds online, over the phone, or now in person for pickup at any branch. And many of the materials are available online as digital resources as well. And we'll have a recording of the event online and through social media following the event. And a couple of quick logistics. Questions for the question and answer portion will be selected from the chat. Please type your questions there throughout the event. We won't be able to get to everyone. However, we will get to as many as time permits. We'll ask the person who is asking the question to unmute yourself to ask. And now I'm going to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Peter Kopp. Dr. Kopp is a public historian of the North American West with specialties in the history of agriculture and the environment. His book, Hoptopia, A World of Agriculture and Beer in Oregon's Willamette Valley, won the American Historical Association's Pacific Coast Branch Book Award for first-time authors. He has also written many articles and developed public history projects on tourism and the National Park Service, the built environment of the Southwest borderlands, and green activism of the Grateful Dead. I'm particularly interested in his upcoming book manuscript on Fabian Garcia, the father of the New Mexico chili. And I am so honored to welcome Dr. Kopp with us today, and I will give it over to you.
Thanks, Reed. Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be virtually in Eugene today. I love Eugene. My family all went to U of O. I went to U of O for a little bit. I was going to wear a duck shirt and rip it open, but I decided not to. My talk today is based on my book that came out a few years ago, Hoptopia. I have indeed. This year I got a big research fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities so I don't have to teach any classes. And so I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I took a shower today. I put on pants. I put on a shirt, put on deodorant. So everything, you know, I really needed this in my life today. So thanks. So this is going to be a quick version. This is going to be a quick version of kind of the fun thesis of my book, which is, or the fun question of my book, which is, why do the beers of the craft beer revolution taste and smell the way they do? And what I argue in the book is it's the result of convergence of forces, of global forces that end up in the Willamette Valley. And I'm so happy to be speaking with a group in the Willamette Valley because everybody else says Willamette in different ways. And I always say, it's Willamette, damn it. And so I've been educating people across the world about that. But anyway, so today I'm going to give a quick talk to explain how Oregon, and specifically the Willamette Valley, was at the center of the craft beer revolution. And it goes back to the origin stories of hops. So it's about a 100-year story. I'm going to try to do it in 20 or 25 minutes here, and I hope you enjoy. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you. Okay, a global history of the Cascade hop. I'm going to start out by suggesting that the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, produce a third of the world's hops. So, and hops are an essential ingredient in beer. They act as they bitter the maltiness of syrupy sweet grain. They provide a bitter element. They provide a nice aromatic element that you can smell in the IPAs of the craft beer revolution. And they also, this plant and its cones, they offer a preservative element, which is really important. They have natural antibacterial agents inside of them that help sustain the shelf life of beer. So if you've heard of an India Pale Ale, the India Pale Ale is a result of English brewers putting tons of hops in their vat and having very hoppy and strong beers for the long trips around Africa to India during the colonial period. So India Pale Ale is a result of lots of hops for preservation purposes. So in any case, for reasons I'm going to describe, a third of the world's hops are grown in the Pacific Northwest, which means a third of the world's beers have this essential ingredient from the Pacific Northwest, because beer is really only made of mostly water, malted grain, so the syrupy sweetness of grain, usually barley, but also wheat and rye and other things, yeast, which creates the alcohol, the fermentation, and then hops, and that's all you need to make beer. I'm from Portland originally, and my parents moved down to Aurora in the Willamette Valley, and I saw these tall climbing vines. They're vines, not vines. I won't get into that right now. On the landscape, and I said, my dad and I were driving around, and I said, "What are these things?" He said, "They're hops." I said, "Like for beer?" And he said, "Yeah, for beer." I said, "Well, that's cool." And that's what started this project over a decade ago. It turned to a dissertation, into a book, and I've traveled around the world meeting beer makers and hop growers, and so I hope you enjoy this story. Here are some hop cones. So you can see the hops grow. I can use my pointer here, top to bottom. So they're really kind of this neat agricultural specimen on the agricultural landscape. Have you seen hops in the landscape? Yes. They grow them everywhere in the Willamette Valley. It's beautiful. And here's a cross section of an experimental hop variety. And you can see this yellow resin, that's the lupulin. That's where the magic happens. That's where the flavor and the aroma and the antibacterial agents come from, is this lupulin. So now that you know what hops are, we'll go into the history of how the Willamette Valley became a center of hop growing. Oh, but first, I wanted also to suggest, whether you are a beer drinker or not, you see hops every day in grocery stores, on billboards, on commercials. If you see a Miller commercial, these hops are right here. Here you have the grain, and here you have the hops. Same thing for Budweiser. You have the hops here and the grain. And of course, we're going to look at some examples from Oregon a little later on. But of course, as the craft beer revolution unfolds, hops become a marketing tool. So you can see even how much more present hops are in the marketing for Sierra Nevada brewing than they are for the mass-produced American lagers here. So that's my challenge. Is I challenge you every day. If you don't see hops, send me an email, because I think you see hops every day of your life. You understand. Okay, I know I usually never put writing on, but there's a first half of this talk, which is the global part, and I'm condensing it. And so we're gonna quickly go over how hops end up in the Americas and North America, and what brewers are doing with them, and what that has to do with the Northwest. The first point is that hop growing emerges in Europe, first in Germany, and then expanding out from Germany all across of Europe for the use in beer making around 800 to 1300 years ago. It reaches England. I don't even know which direction. England's over here. So reaches England by the 1300s. And the important part of this, number two, is that even though this is one species of hop, which is called Humulus lupulus L, there are different, across the different landscapes and terrains and environments and climates of Europe, there are oops, there are different land, oops, I can't highlight. I was going to try to highlight land races. In any case, there are different land races. And a land race is a same species of a hop, but it's going to have, or of a plant, but it's going to have different physical characteristics, okay? And so for brewers, that means, and so the cones might be different sizes, the colors of the leaves might be different sizes, depending on their elevation and how much water they get and such. So the land races become essential to specific European traditions. So the landrace hops from Germany are going to be essential to brewing German lagers, for example. And the landrace hop varieties that are grown in England are going to be specific for English ales and porters and stouts, okay? This is really important because number 3, when Europeans colonize the rest of the world, they bring their brewing traditions with them, and they bring specific recipes from their mother country. And so those specific landrace hops fit those recipes. So even though, for example, there are native hops in China, there are native hops in what becomes the United States, European immigrant brewers are always going to want to import those landrace varieties that existed in their mother country. You with me? Okay. Okay, so of course, North America becomes part of the colonizing efforts of Europeans, and but brewers are going to continue, even though there are native hops in North America, brewers are going to continue to import, which is very expensive and time consuming. They're going to import hops from Europe. Okay, so that takes us to about the 1850s, the 1860s. German brewing arises in North America. You can see the image on the left is the Anheuser company that eventually becomes the Anheuser-Busch. You can see the hops even on the advertising back here in the 1850s or 1860s. Well, Anheuser is still going to bring in German hops. This is expensive. It's not cost effective. That said, there is an emerging hop industry in New York and New England and Wisconsin. But even if you look at the records of the British House of Commons, they'll say, we don't want to import this stuff. It's too pungent. It's too bitter. It's too striking. It's too strong. It doesn't fit our recipes, okay? So even though hops aren't fitting the recipes of European brewers, the first major brewery that many of you have heard of was the city brewery that becomes, with its hops here, Weinhard's Brewing in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, established here in 1862 with the influx of German immigrants in the 1850s and 60s. The Weinhard Brewery is much further away than the Midwest and East Coast breweries. And so Weinhard's and other Northwest brewers are going to start to look for a local hop supply. Because if they're lucky, they'll get old hops that were shipped from New York to San Francisco and then up to the Pacific Northwest. And they're not going to be fresh. They're not going to be good. So brewers are willing to take a gamble. And even by the first Northwest hop yards are put in right in 1865, 1866. And then this is an early 20th century history of the Weinhard Brewery. And for those of us that grew up in Portland, we know the smell of the brewing blocks, right? We know the malty smell of West Burnside until that brewery shut down, geez, maybe 20 years ago or so. In any case, they're going to start to use Pacific Northwest hops that are grown in places like, Eugene and Corvallis and Salem and Aurora. So this is a hop field from, this is a little bit later, about the 1880s or 1890s. You can see the hops grew on these tall timbers, and you would plant these timber posts here, the timber post every spring, and the hops would wind the way around them. And then they would hire these strong men to pull out the timbers and lay them down, and people would hand pick the hops, which is an important part of Willamette Valley history, is the history of labor. And I'll go into that a little bit, and hopefully we can answer that in the questions too. Okay, so there's a nascent hop industry. Some of the Pacific Northwest brewers are interested in signing contracts with the farmers in the Willamette Valley. This guy has a great beard. And, but there's not a large American interest. And then something totally radical happens, something off the wall. Krakatoa, the volcano in Indonesia, erupts in the early 1880s. And it changes the world's weather. And in fact, it clouds the skies even across Europe, leading to a total drop in output. Some places 50, 60, 70, even 80% of crops, including hops across Europe, are destroyed because of a volcano in Indonesia. What happens? The Pacific Northwest takes advantage. And everybody with any farmland starts growing 10, 15, 20 acres of hops, because the year before they got 5 cents a pound. In 1883, they got $1 a pound of hops. So everybody and all their friends started growing hops. And this transformed the economy. It brought a lot of money to the Pacific Northwest, and it transformed the landscape. First, you can see the hop fields, which are really cool in themselves. But then you have the emergence of hundreds of hop dryers, for those of you interested in historic preservation and architectural history. The hop dryers, you would take these big loads of hops to a second floor and spread them out. And then you would have coal or wood heat, later natural gas, on the bottom. It would dry the hops to about 90% of their weight so that you could ship them and market them. So there's changes on the landscape, there's changes in the economy. But the key here is that European brewers across the world were forced to buy their product from the Pacific Northwest. And so from the early 1880s into the 19th century, the Pacific Northwest is on the radar of brewers around the globe. Now, labor is a really important part of this story. I can't go into too much detail because we don't have too much time, but it was a multicultural, people of all ages, families would come out to pick hops together. There's a lot of racism in this story too, because camps were segregated. You would have essentially Chinese camps, Japanese camps, African-American camps, Mexican camps, or Hispanic or Latin American camps, with the idea of trying to keep labor from having any power. And also there was other racist elements. If you were white, you got paid $1 for 100 pounds picked. If you were Chinese, you got 90 cents, and so on and so forth. And so that's an important legacy that I discuss in my book. I don't have too much time to talk about it right here, but I think that's really important. In any case, despite the European distaste for American hops and Pacific Northwest hops, they see the future. The brewers around the world see a future in the Pacific Northwest. And in 1905, the quintessential Irish brewing company, Guinness Brewing, they signed a multiple year contract with Willamette Valley growers to use Oregon hops exclusively in their brews. So this is really important, right? Because here you have a global business using Willamette Valley hops for their quintessential Irish beer. Now, at the same time, 1905, we see the emergence of the Prohibition Movement. And Carrie Nation is the face of this movement across the United States. She's famous. This is a famous cartoon from about 1900 where she smashes up a bar in Kansas. And, you know, Prohibition is an important part of the story. Again, I'm not going to go too much into detail, but I will say that by the 1910s, about half the states in the country had already gone dry. Oregon first votes to go dry in 1912. They don't go dry actually until 1915 or 1916. But if you look at the newspapers, the farmers were saying, we need a beer industry. We need a beer industry because this crop is so important to us and it's made us a lot of money. In any case, the 18th Amendment passed, the nation goes dry in 1900. So what was this? The nascent hop industry emerged into a global power, and then national prohibition hits. So what happened? What's the fate of the American hop growers? Ironically, they do quite well in the 1920s, because during World War I, European agricultural landscapes were ravaged. So once again, global brewers had to turn to the Pacific Northwest. So despite national prohibition and not having a domestic beer industry, acreage expands every year in the 1920s in the Willamette Valley in the Pacific Northwest, which is quite remarkable if you think about it. And of course, these images are referring to near beer, which was legal during Prohibition, and then Bevo was, I think, Budweiser, or was it Olympia? I can't remember. In any case, this was their, this was a soda pop. So breweries reinvented themselves as soda makers, candy makers, all these types of things. One of my favorite stories about Prohibition is that the national pastime was making bathtub gin, right? But this stuff did not taste good. And so the brewers actually did quite well because they would sell their Bevo or their other soft drinks to make the illegal hooch taste a little bit better. So in any case, fast forwarding a little bit, Pacific Northwest and Willamette Valley hop growers do quite well during Prohibition. I'm gonna skip that. Oh, here, and the labor story also is tied to this period as well. This is a photograph. Oh, I never saw this guy's sideburns before. This is great. Sorry, I notice new things on photographs all the time. These are a group from the Grand Ronde Indians who made a yearly trek to the hop yards of Eugene and Salem and Corvallis. And so on and so forth. So I just wanted to emphasize the labor story is really important. And again, you get that more in my book than the focus of today's talk. Anyway, Prohibition's over. And on April 7th, 3.5% beer is legal. Beer enthusiasts call this New Beer's Eve. And Budweiser here brings their Clydesdales to the capital. And what we see in the Willamette Valley is an expansion of hop growing even more. So by the 1920s, it's further accelerated. And by here, you can see the technology has changed. There's no longer those timber posts. Oops. They are trellises, more similar than that we see today. I just love this photograph. This is outside of, it'll come back to me. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out what side the river's at on. Not important, moving on. Okay, so here's the deal. The Willamette Valley, or I'm sorry, European hop growers start to, European agriculturalists start to increase the hop market in the early 1920s, but then Mother Nature adds a devastating reality, which is a horrible disease called Downy Mildew ravages European growers. And so once again, even though European brewers across the world want European hops, the world once again turns to the Pacific Northwest. So the Willamette Valley here is very lucky in these regards. That said, in 1930, that same disease, Downy Mildew, reaches the Pacific Northwest and the Willamette Valley. So growers try different kinds of sprays. Now it's Downy Mildew, right? Because I say we, but I used to live there in Oregon with you. It's a temperate rainforest, it's wet, so mildew diseases thrive. So they tried to spray the crops with all kinds of things, tobacco, trees from, bark from different trees, whale oil, all kinds of different things, but nothing worked. And so by 1935, there's a decline in hop production in the Willamette Valley, and then because of this disease, and an increase in the Yakima Valley where it's dry and the mildew disease does not take over. But, and this is very important, because the Willamette Valley had established itself as the hop center of the world, right around the time they signed those contracts with Guinness, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, they created a hop research and breeding program in Corvallis at what becomes Oregon State University in 1930. And the idea was to gather hops from Europe, from Asia, from North America, even hops from South Africa and Australia, and they would crossbreed these hops with the idea that they want to create, and this is based on Mendel's theory of inheritance, right? Every plant or animal has their own genes, and they pass down a certain set of genes to their progeny, to their children. And so they're trying to crossbreed hop varieties starting in 1930 in Corvallis that would be disease resistant and appealing to brewers. Okay, so this is really important because the Willamette Valley had established itself as the hop center of the world. The scientific and crossbreeding center arises, the national one in Corvallis. And they have all kinds of great scientists working. Well, the 1930s pass and they don't have a new American crossbred hybrid hop yet. The 1940s pass and they don't have a new American hybrid yet. The industry continues to decline in the Willamette Valley. The 1950s pass and there's no new hybrid. They've gone through 4 or 5 directors by this point. And it's not till the 1960s. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's an image of one of the greenhouses where they're growing all these different varieties. And it takes about 7 or 8 years, maybe even 10 years sometimes, to identify if a hybrid is going to be disease resistant and useful to brewers and also produce well. So it's not till 1965 that this gentleman here named Alfred Honnold, an Austrian-born plant geneticist, is hired by Oregon State University. And here, when I was working on this project, and Al and I became good friends. He's still alive and lives in Corvallis. He becomes the director of the hop program in the mid 1960s, and he inherits a hop called USDA 56012. And I memorized that for a specific reason, because it means the hop was bred in 1956 and it was the 12th cross of that season. So USDA 56012 is the name of this hop. And for the first time since 1930, it looks like there might be an American hybrid worth releasing to the public. And he does, and the USDA do in 1972. And this hop is called Cascade. And Cascade, has anybody heard of Cascade hop before? Well, you'll remember this when you see your Miller Lite on the billboard there. Cascade hop was born of a European and a North American parent that they crossbred. And there was another global shortage in the early 1970s, and brewers, particularly Coors, came out and said, Oregon and Northwest hop growers, if you plant these Cascades, which are disease resistant to Downy Mildew, produce well and proved well in brewing trials, we will give you a premium. So once again, we see an echo of what happened almost a century before. But what happens is the Coors drinkers, they have their first pint and they say, okay, and they have their second pint. And then they say, this is too pungent. This is too strong. This is too hoppy. In other words, they said the exact same thing that was said in the House of Commons 150 years prior in England. North American hops were just too strong for the beer varieties that were to be produced. Yet, at the same time, there is a craft beer revolution that's unfolding in California and then in Colorado and Seattle and Portland areas. And the craft beer revolution, they're inspired by rejecting the bland decades of the 1950s and 1960s. They're rejecting Campbell's soup. They're rejecting TV's dinner and McDonald's. They're embracing Julia Childs. They're embracing French cuisine and fine wine and the California wines. And they say, well, we want to do something new with our beer. And so what do? They say, oh, hey, Al, can you send us some of these Cascade hops? And what happens is the Cascade becomes the cornerstone hop of the craft beer revolution, starting in California as early as 1976, and then expanding here in the early 1980s. This is Ken Grossman from Sierra Nevada, and he makes the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. If you've ever had a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, the key hop is the Cascade, and the Cascade becomes the featured hop across the country, even in Brooklyn. This is Garrett Oliver, the founder of Brooklyn Brewery and the head brewer, and then Jim Cook, of course, of Boston Brewing, St. Adams. They're going to use the Cascade and market craft beer upon the success of the Cascade. So as where the Coors and the Budweiser of the world, they rejected the strong hop, the craft brewers loved it. And the same happened in Oregon, So in Oregon, some of the three first brewers that the first three craft brewers in Oregon are here are the McMenamin brothers. Here are the Widmer brothers. And here is Carl Ockert and Dick and Nancy Ponzi, who are winemakers, but then they start Bridgeport Brewing. And at the center of all their ales, Cascade hop. And before he retires in 1996, Al Honnold is going to release 24 more varieties of hops, and these craft brewers are going to seize upon all of them. And that's how the Willamette Valley became the center of the flavors and the aromas of the craft beer revolution. And so today, here's all the beers from the Willamette Valley. You can see the hop is featured so just on the center of all the stuff. Hop Harvest and Devil Mountain Ale and Ninkasi, down in Eugene, fresh squeezed IPA. So that's all to say, the contents of your pint glass have a much richer history than you might have imagined. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really incredible, and I learned so much. I'm a beer fan and obviously a Willamette Valley fan, and learned so much. So the first question we're going to go to is Brandon. And so if you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask, that would be great.
Yes, I was just curious that, all of the ingredients in beers, yeast, grain, the hops, and the water can be influenced by local conditions, terroir, basically. So I was just wondering where you get the most influence or most difference in the taste among those ingredients.
I'm trying to answer that question in a creative way. In terms of terroir, I think it's most significant with the hops, okay? Because you're going to grow grain, and the grain is going to taste the same whether you grow it in British Columbia or Sacramento Valley for the most part. Water is a bit different. Water is really important in terms of the mineral makeup and the chemical makeup of the water. For example, Olympia Brewery, right? Olympia's brewery's motto is "It's the water," and so water is really important too. And then yeast, there's all kinds of different yeast strains. So my creative answer was that the cool thing about craft beer right now is for about 20 years, it was all about the hop. But now people are playing around with all those other elements, right? Different kind of champagne yeast and open fermented, Rogue Brewery, one of the brewers uses yeast out of his beer to grow a beer, which is, I've never tried that one. I just can't bring myself to do it. But I guess my answer is all of the above, but I would have a longer answer about how terroir influences hops. The most important part is that we don't know why, but North American hops are just stronger and more pungent and more bitter than European hops. For example, because the craft beer expands across the world and people grow, I was just, before the pandemic, I was working on a side project of this in England, and they grow Cascade hops, but they're not as strong there, and we don't know why. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I talked.
Thank you. Ellen.
Hi, I thought that was fascinating. Thank you. I was wondering about how climate change might affect the growing of hops in the Pacific Northwest. Have growers been concerned? Are they doing any modifications?
Absolutely. I think everybody's thinking about that right now in all across agriculture. Because maybe the Willamette Valley is going to be the next Napa Valley of wine, and hops move up to British Columbia or something like that. But scientists are continuing to crossbreed hops to address these issues. And so, for example, one of the concerns is that you don't want a hop to mature too quickly. And so they're trying to breed hops to to find certain crosses that slow down breeding so you can hit the sweet spot of when things are hot. But it's a guessing game, right? And so there's a lot of concern, but I think what's happening in terms of the science is that they're trying to produce enough varieties that to sustain the industry based on various models. But yeah, we're all thinking about it. And there's also all kinds of new technologies that are interesting in terms of, you know, you can, it's not just for hops, but you can water specific crops like and insert certain minerals into the ground at certain moments of the day when they need it. And so they're monitored and their roots and conditions are monitored at all times. Good question.
Lisa.
Yeah. Oh, I concur. I just have been enjoying this talk so much. I have lots of questions, but I'll try to restrain myself. And the one I popped in the chat was, I told someone I was going to listen to this today, and they said, "Oh, have you read Bitter Harvest?" And I said, "No." So naturally, I Googled it and it looked really interesting. And I figured you might have some thoughts to share on that as far as the Chinese labor force that you, I think, mentioned earlier, and just that whole history. Would you care to expand on that?
Sure. Yeah, I worked with the producers of Bitter Harvest a little bit to talk, and really this is a story of Chinese immigrants who are picking hops in the Pacific Northwest and how they were treated and how they contributed to the local and the global economy. A couple things are interesting in this story, which is that a lot of the Chinese laborers ended up becoming farmers themselves and growing hops and harvesting and hiring people to harvest their hops too. A lot of people, Chinese or otherwise, didn't even know what hops were for. They just knew that it was just, this could make them money, right? But the conditions, the intense conditions of Bitter Harvest, of course, is there's several riots and lots of violence surrounding the Chinese in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm not sure what you want me to comment on. What else you want me to comment on?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I was just kind of curious because you alluded to it a couple of times in your talk about, like, there's a whole other story about like labor and land ownership and the cultivation of hops. So yeah, anything you wanted to share or not beyond what you just said.
This is what I'll say then, which is that by 1913, there's a major hop riot in Wheatland, California. And the riot is started because labor was putting pressure for better conditions, right? Better toilets out in the field, better pay, more breaks, these types of things. And it's basically immigrants that were, in this case, I believe they're Indian, as in Southeast Asian immigrants, were blamed for this riot that ends up killing several people. As a result of the Wheatland hop riot, farmers across the West Coast are going to very purposefully try to hire white people and white families. And they're going to try to create a white family atmosphere so that there are fewer racial tensions, basically. So you can see how the blame gets put on immigrants. This is not an unfamiliar story. But as a result, if you look to the newspapers, the advertisements are saying, we are looking for a hop harvest, and this harvest is 2 or 3 weeks at the end of summer. Please bring your white families. And they would use this language, right? And so this lasts up into the 1920s. The presence of immigrant laborers continues, but that tension is really important. It's something I discuss at great length. But that's the Wheatland riot is the pivoting point towards the whitening of the hop harvest for anti-immigrant and racist reasons.
I have a question. Thinking about over this past year, and the pandemic has made so much harder, but there's also been a lot of innovation and kind of new ways of doing things. Have you seen anything that has been particularly interesting kind of coming out of the beer industry or hop industry this past year that kind of uniquely came from this opportunity?
I really like that question, but I've been so obsessed with New Mexico chili and writing this other book. I like that question, but I don't have an answer for it. I'm sorry.
Well, that leads into my next question, which was, how are you? I've had a lot of New Mexican chili beer, which is not my favorite. You might enjoy that. But what would you have to say about kind of the crossover between your two interests, or where you found that?
I love it. I have a talk that I give sometimes called the chili beer talk, and it does cross because they're both specialty crops. They're different regions. They have different scientific and labor stories, different transnational stories. So there's a lot of overlap there. Bring me back next year and I'll talk chili.
Wonderful. Rody?
Yes. Peter, thank you for a charming talk. Now we all have to read the book. I'm a fairly recent import to the Pacific Northwest and an avid fan of craft beers. And I've learned that Cascade and Chinook and Citra hops, all with the C start, tend to be a little too yellow and piney, as is the alliterative Simcoe. So I'm finding, paying attention to the hops that the brewers are touting in their brews is a good way to do some triage regarding the beers one would like to try. But it's hard to keep up because apparently there are all kinds of hybrids and new names coming out all the time. So I guess beyond those observations, my question would be, do you know, can you steer me to browner and more bitter IPAs, for example, rather than the lighter and pinier or shudder hazy brews?
Mm-hmm. First, I'm going to comment on the first half, which is really important. You'll notice that Al Honnold named his hop Columbia. The next two hops he's going to release in 1976 are called Willamette and, I'm sorry, Cascade was 1972. And then 1976, he's going to release Willamette and Columbia, right? Named after the river areas. And then you mentioned Chinook, right? The Chinookan people, the Chinookan language, the Chinookan salmon. So Al Honnold named them after very specific regional markers. Simcoe and some of these other ones are a result. After Honnold retired, it became legal to patent plants. So the USDA takes itself out of the game of breeding new hop varieties, and it's now a privatized exercise, and it is to this day. And they're going to name their hops Titan, Simcoe, all these really kind of strong names because these are strong hops. So part of it is, if you recognize, this doesn't answer your second question, but if you recognize hops with Pacific Northwest names, those came from Al Honnold. All the other ones are new varieties that are super strong and powerful. And I don't like those either. I like the milder hops. I like more like English brown ales and stuff like that myself. To answer your question though, it's almost the same to read, which is same answer to read, which it's so hard to keep up with all the new breweries. You know, when I was growing up and my dad introduced me to craft beer, there was Widmer, there was McMenamin's, you know, Bridgeport and Rogue. And now there are 15 on your block. So, my advice for this type of question is you just have to go explore. And part of that exploration will be, you might find an IPA or a hazy IPA that you like. For example, in Denver, I just found, I don't like a hazy IPA, but I just found they started making something called a milkshake IPA, which tastes like a milkshake and it's IPA, and I love it, you know, for one or two, but sorry, I don't have a good answer for your question either. But again, I got to talk some more, and that's important.
I'm going to ask. I've just had, one of the things we love about Eugene is the high brewery per capita ratio compared to lots of other places. So thanks.
Yeah, because when I moved out of the Willamette Valley, you had Ninkasi and Oakshire, I think, and that was about it. And now I have a conference in Eugene next year. I can't wait to get back and will travel for one, and drink good beer in Eugene for another. Thanks for the question.
I'm going to ask one other question, and then I'll hand it over to Lisa. First, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for this really interesting and delightful chat. And do you have any beer recommendations for us?
I've been getting to know Colorado beers, so I don't, if you see a milkshake IPA, try that. Otherwise, the famous beer writer, Fred Eckert of Portland, he made Portland beer scene famous. He was a famous national beer writer too. When people asked him, what's your favorite beer, or what beer should I try? He said, the beer in hand. So once again, I have horrible answers for you. I'm so sorry. Just explore. That's what I always say. That's what I'm doing in Colorado right now.
That's not a bad directive for testing beer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lisa, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, sure. I think you're handing it over to me to announce next month's speaker, but I just had a quick question, if I may. One last following up on something that you mentioned at the top of your talk. Do you ever eat hops or use them when you cook, Peter? I dropped a recipe in the chat for a risotto that I've made a couple of times, and I enjoyed a lot when I used to live abroad, and where you could actually find it on menus. But I just wondered if you had any tips for using hops in cooking.
No, that's really interesting, though.
It's
I use beer in cooking, but not hops in cooking.
okay.
What part do you use?
It's like the tender shoot of the hop.
Yeah.
And it produces a really, I mean, it's not a flavor, like everyone would love. It's kind of bitter, as you might expect.
I heard it's like bitter asparagus.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of weedy and bitter. Yeah, great. I've never heard asparagus, but yeah.
I'm gonna have to try it. And lupulo, lupulo. Yeah, it's because hops Latin is Cumulus lupulus, which is the wolf of the willow. And
right.
So yeah, that's cool.
When you said that, I was like, oh my God, lupulo, of course, the risotto. Yeah, that makes sense. Anyway, okay, well, good. Enjoy your risotto if you get around to making it. So yeah, thank you as well. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm super excited to introduce to the audience our speaker for next month, who's Jose Spellman Lopez.